In this tutorial I'm going to show you how to make this jewellery case, which when you open it up makes perfect storage for your jewellery, for your earrings, for your rings, for your necklaces, for bangles. Each one of these necklaces can actually push inside the pocket to keep it nice and safe, and it's covered over with a piece of felt so they don't knock against each other. And you've got a zip pouch as well, so you can keep things more secure in there. So again, it's perfect storage for at home, but what a great gift idea, and what a great idea if you're going away for any length of time, so you can take all of your jewellery with you. So store it all in here, pop it in your suitcase, and you're ready to go. So let's take a look at the materials that you need, and then let's get sewing. I want to show you a couple of tools that I find really useful. One of them is your hole punch, and this is going to punch the holes that your earrings are going to go in along the strip of felt. And it's ever so simple. My particular one has a disc that you can turn around so you can choose different sizes of holes. I've chosen the smallest, so just click around to here, and then literally you're just going to put your fabric or your felt underneath there, give it a squeeze, obviously over the marked place, and then you end up with your little holes in there. So on the felt strip, I've actually made my holes 1 inch apart along the side of the strip and 1 inch apart widthways as well. But you may be able to put more on there or less on there depending on how many earrings you'd like to store. The other tool that's worth investing in is this one. It's to put poppers on. It's a popper application tool. These are how the poppers look. So you're going to have one half with a point coming out, and then the other two pieces are kind of an innie and an outie. So with felt, you can simply push the point through over the correct position where it needs to be, put the back on, sit it inside the tool, give it a squish, and it's on. It's as simple as that. And it's a great tool for putting poppers onto clothes, children's clothes, or duvet covers, quilts and things like that. Just make sure when you're putting the poppers on the strips for the project here, you're going to put them facing each other. So just in the same way for both sides. Give it a squish. So when you fold it over, you've got both of the outside of the poppers on the outside, and you can see it fastens together in a loop, and you can see it's quite sturdy as well. Okay, so that's that one. You'll need to do 3 of those strips, as I've already done here, and then we'll put those on later on when we start to construct the whole case. But the first thing we're going to do is the zipped pocket. So you'll have 2 lining pieces and 2 outer pieces, all cut to the same size, and then your zip is going to go across the top. So as usual, I've got a zip that's too long because I like to cut them down to size, and I'm going to sew these one by one to the top of the patterned fabric, and then we'll sew the lining on the opposite side. You can do this all in one go if you're a little bit more experienced or a bit more confident with your zip sewing, but I'll do these one at a time just so that I can explain how I'm doing that. I'm not putting the zipper foot on my machine. You can if you prefer, but I find with my machine I can just sew straight over the top of the teeth. And I don't tend to pin where zips are concerned. I find the length of time it takes to pin and unpin as I'm sewing, I can just put the zip in. When you come to the slider, simply move that out of the way, so lift the foot right up out of the way, but leave the needle down, and then carry on sewing. So that's the zip on one part of the fabric. Then I'll need to sew this one onto the opposite side, and I always find it easier to sew from the zip side because then I know I'm sewing halfway down the tape. Again, when I come to that slider, needle down, foot out of the way, and just manoeuvre that slider out of the stitch line. Where have you gone? There you are. So that's how we're looking at the moment. So the zip's right in the centre of the two pieces of fabric, and what I need to do now is to put the lining pieces onto the opposite side. So with the zip in the centre, let's move this one out of the way again. Fabric right side down, trapping the zip in between the outer and the lining fabric, and we're going to sew straight across again. So now I have the outer pieces on the outside of the zip, the lining pieces on the lining side of the zip, and just to help me when I sew the whole thing together, I'm just going to hand sew the open end of the zip closed, just to hold it in place while I'm sewing. So you won't see those stitches, they're inside the seam allowance, so you won't have to remove them either, literally just to hold that in place. Now if you wanted to put some top stitching across there, then you can do, but what I'm going to do now is to fold all of the pieces together. Press that as you go if your iron's on. And there's the second side. With the zip across the top. Then this is going to go on top of one end of the lining of my case. Make sure it's nice and square. I'm not worried about the zip being a little bit long or the edges not matching up perfectly at the moment, because I'll trim all of that down before I put the bias binding on. And then again within the seam allowance, just to hold these in place, I'm going to sew down both sides and a little bit across the bottom as well. Take my pins out. There we go, and then that section's finished. So next up we're going to put these strips of felt across the top here, around about 1.5 inches apart. Do more of those if you wanted to as well, it will fit more. Don't put them too close to the edge though, because we are going to put some bias binding across there. So you could use your glue stick, basting stick. I'm just going to put a few pins to hold this in place and sew straight across the centre, and that's going to hold all three of those pieces in place. And then finally, to keep my jewellery nice and safe and to stop it knocking against each other, I'm going to put the strip of felt across the top, so just place it across the top of those three smaller strips and sew down the one side to secure. So let's put this to one side for the moment. I'm going to make the finger for the ring. So take your strip of fabric, fold it in half, right sides together, and we're just going to sew it along the long side. then take the strip, twist it so that the seam's sitting in the middle. I'm just going to open out the seam, so we're like this, and then just sew across the end. And now we can turn the whole thing the right side out. Now I find the easiest way to do this is to take a pair of tweezers, grab hold of the end, and then push these inside the tube. So I'm just gripping onto the tweezers still. Now on a shorter tube like this, you can push the fabric all the way through to the end. If you're making something longer than this, maybe it's a strap for a dress or something like that, then I just start it off with the tweezers. I'm just pushing the ends out now. And there you go. And then use a knitting needle or the likes. So there I have my tube, but the seam is sitting right along the centre. So I'm going to flatten the end and just finger crease that and sew straight across the seam end, about 1/2 inch from the end. So that's going to prevent the stuffing from going right up to the end. And the reason for that is because on the end of here, we're going to put a popper. So I'll do that after we've stuffed it. And with the stuffing of the toy filler, I'm just using a small amount at a time, because you find with a small amount of toy filler, it's more time consuming, but it means that you don't get any big lumps. If you put a big lump of toy filler inside there, it could potentially just be a big lump of toy filler. And we're going to pad this up. So just keep going, and I'm just going to fill this until it's about 1/2 inch from the other end, because I don't want to be sewing over the toy filler when I put this into the seam. So just keep pushing that down until it's all filled up. So just make sure your toy filler is nice and even. And then we're going to add 1/2 of the popper to the end here. Now because this is a little bit thicker than the felt I was using earlier, I'm actually going to use a bradawl to make a little hole through the fabric first. So again, push 1/2 or the spiky half of the popper through the hole. On goes the back. Sit it into the tool and give it a squish. Then take open your case again. And this is going to sit about 5 inches from the top, so that when it all folds over, I don't want this sitting underneath where the crease is. It's going to go here. So I'm going to sew one end across the end here. I'll trim that down afterwards, because again I don't want the popper on this side too close to the edge, because my bias binding is going to go here. So you may need to trim that down, in which case I'll take some filler out. And we'll just sew across the end of that to hold it in place. You can measure and mark all of this if you prefer. Just so you've got all the measurements on your instructions, which you'll find on the Create and Craft blog. So I'll put a link to that at the bottom of the screen. And you've got photographic step-by-step instructions there as well, so you may find that easier. So if you wanted to measure all of these pieces to make sure they're evenly spaced, then do feel free. I'm just going to put a little mark underneath the popper here, and I can see that that's straight. And again, let's make a little hole in here. This time the spiked part of your popper comes from the back. Second part goes here. Just push that through and then give it a squish with your tool. That's it, really easy. Just going to trim these loose threads away and make this neat. And that fastens on there. The final part to go on here is the felt, which again I'm going to sew just along the edges inside the seam allowance to hold that in place. But I'm also going to put one row of stitches straight down the centre, and that's to stop it kind of bagging. Now you can really kind of tailor make this to suit. If you've got more rings than will sit on that finger, then maybe leave off the earring holder and put another ring holder. In fact, there is room for two if you really wanted to. Maybe you're going away for a while and you want to take all of your jewels with you. There we go. Let's trim that away. Right, now I've got two pieces of ribbon to fasten this. So one of them is going to go facing downwards right in the centre of this end. So you could just fold that in half to crease the centre point if you like. And the second piece of ribbon is actually going to go on the outside. And you can tell which way this is going to go by just placing them all the pieces together like this. So my second piece of ribbon needs to go on the outside just here. And I have measured that for you, and it's going to be 6.5 inches from the end. So measure the centre line and then measure 6.5 inches down, and that's where I'm going to put the ribbon. And to make the end of this neat, I'm just going to fold the end of the ribbon under and then place it face down over my mark and then sew across the top, and then I don't see the raw end of the ribbon. And I'm just going to sew 2 lines across here for 2 reasons. For once it'll make it strong, and secondly, even when the ribbon folds back, you don't see the end of the ribbon where it's folded over. So let's just take that off. Right, let's sew the 2 pieces together then. So we'll need the ribbons at opposite ends. So you can place the whole thing together again, first of all, just to make sure you've got the ribbon in the right place. So as it folds over, both of those ends of the ribbons should meet, like so. So that's how you're going to tie it. So you can use a little 505 spray or repositionable spray adhesive to hold those layers together if you like. I'm simply going to put a few pins in the centre, and then I'm going to go straight to putting the bias binding on. I like to sew my bias binding onto the first side by machine and then wrap it around and sew the second side by hand. I find for me it looks neater. I'm just cutting off the end of the zip. And I actually enjoy the hand sewing. I find it quite relaxing. Now then, let's make sure that ribbon's out of the way. I'm going to sew from this side and hand sew from the underside. So I'm just starting off by folding the end of the bias tape over, attaching that to one side of my work, and I'm going to sew in the crease line all the way around. And I'm going to miter the corners, and I'll show you quickly how to do that. Now, so let's come up to the first corner. I'm just going to take it easy as I'm going over the zip. There we go. Now, as I'm coming up to the corner, and you don't need to mark this every single time, the edge of my work is here. I can feel that. I'm going to stop sewing here, so this forms a box. So that measurement is the same as that measurement. So when you come up to that mark, and again, you don't have to mark this every single time. This is just so that you can see what I'm doing. I'm going to stop stitching here and actually cut my thread and take my work out. And then line up the edges, turn your work around, line up the edges. This will need trimming a little bit. But so that the edge of your bias binding meets the edge of your fabric, and you've got this fold like a triangle in the corner. So I'll just sew a little bit along here and I'll show you why. So now when I fold this back, and my bias binding goes around the corner, I get this really neat 45-degree mitre in the corner. And I just think that looks so smart. Do that on all four corners. When you come back to the beginning where you folded over the bias binding, then just overlap it slightly. Now you may need to trim some of this down a little bit. You may need to take the pins out as well. Let's pop that back again. I undid the poppers while I sewed around there. So pins all out. And you can see that some of the fabric needs trimming so that the bias binding sits around it easier. So if you do find you need to trim that just slightly, that's absolutely fine. Kind of expect that to happen. Sometimes depending on what type of wadding you're using, the wadding can shift a little bit as you're sewing, and well, it kind of grows. So again, if you need to trim it down, just trim it down. It's going to make it easier to sew your bias binding on, because we're going to do that bit by hand now. Another little bit just here. Okay, so take the edge of your binding, fold it over, so the stitches that you can see through here that are holding the bias binding, I want to cover those over, so that's going to make it neat. So I like to hide the knot of my thread inside the seam allowance. Just shorten that a bit. Fold the tape over, and then I'm just going to catch the fold of the tape with my needle and thread and go directly underneath it back into the work, and then take the needle through and out again about 1/4 of an inch away. So the smaller the stitches you can make, the neater it's all going to look. And I'm just using a white thread here. Ideally use the same colour as your bias binding for the most invisible binding. So I'll just carry on sewing all the way around, and then we'll be finished. So there's my jewellery roll all finished. My ring holder pops on here. This is where I can put my necklaces or bracelets and secure those. Those can keep nice and tidy inside the pocket with an extra pocket that zips over. Let's just trim that off. So you can keep things nice and securely inside there. And of course, I've already started to put my earrings inside the earring section. This folds over, ties in a bow. Now we're finished. So I hope you enjoyed the tutorial, and most of all, I hope you enjoy making yours.